often we as fans don't really get an understanding of what an editor does, right? When we hear the words editor, it's usually followed by like editorial interference. And that's kind of all we get as fans. What is the job of a comic book editor?
Okay. I've always said this, and I've been regarded as kind of as a crackpot for saying it, but
Mm,
I think editor is a misnomer. That
mm,
that's a really bad title, and I think traditionally comics from the 30s to this to now, they've adopted that title because we were printing things on paper and
mm,
running things, and in those days it was newsprint and it was on a web press just like newspapers. And so they would think, well, the guy who hires the writers and artists and who coordinates their efforts and so forth, well, that person would be called an editor. The problem is editing is the least thing that an editor does. Editing is like the smallest part of their workload.
mm.
What an editor does is an editor is given charge of a franchise. I was given charge of the Spider-Man franchise. Big mistake, by the way. But I was given charge. I was 22 years old, and they handed me the keys to Spider-Man, which was a huge chunk of Marvel's revenue
Mm,
of their bottom line. So anything that had to do with Spider-Man, you had to come see me. Okay. And So an editor is usually given charge of a franchise, and their job, her or his job, is to basically maintain and that franchise and generate revenue from that franchise and keep that franchise going. So, like with Star Trek, you have to create the illusion of progress and continuity while not straying too far away that you can't find your way back.
right.
If you think about it, what an editor is more like a television producer,
Mm,
where a producer is like a showrunner who is, given the keys to this particular franchise, and your job is to generate revenue from that franchise and keep that franchise alive. So, I would rather the industry called us producers.
right.
And for a while, I started like signing things at DC produced by Jim Owsley,
Mm,
and people took that as an ego trip, and that really wasn't what it was about. It was about being more accurate about what I was doing, because editing was just the smallest part of that job. Real quick, just a nod toward editorial interference.
mm,
Just bear in mind that a lot of times decisions that are made at the editor's desk come from way over the editor's head.
mm,
When I was an editor, I was working under Jim Shooter, and Jim Shooter had very specific ideas about story and art and about, the quality that he wanted from Marvel. Jim Shooter was a guy, as I explained, who wanted to make comics better and
mm,
have them come out on time.
right.
And those are two opposing ideas.
Yeah.
You can make them better, but that means a lot of redos and sending stuff back. And he's like a guy who comes to the restaurant and keeps sending the meal back.
Mm,
The Jim would send the meal back, but this Jim, because I adopted the name Jim. Okay. Okay. My name is Christopher. My name has always been Christopher.
okay.
My mom called me Chris. My wives called me Chris before they wised up and ran away from me. Everybody in my life called me Chris, except when I went to Marvel. There was a bunch of guys up there named Jim. There was Jim Shooter, and there was Jim Salicrup, Jim
Mm,
Novak. There was a bunch of Jims up there, and I wanted to fit in. So I went, ooh, my middle name is James. I'll be a Jim. Okay, so I ended up being a Jim as well. So anyway, Jim Shooter would send the meal back at the restaurant, but Jim Owsley, the
mm,
editor, I'm the guy who would take the heat for it, because I would not want to go to my creative people and go, well, Jim Shooter is a mean guy and he did this and he did that. I would just go, no, I'm sending it back, even though, it really wasn't my call. So sometimes these decisions come from above the editor's head. Now, skip ahead to today. DC is owned by Discovery Plus, at least this week,
right.
because that changes a lot. Marvel is owned by Disney. And
Mm,
now every script that I write for those two major companies is sent through their standards and practices.
mm,
So now we have lawyers And then we have standards and practices people. These are two different sets of people. The lawyers are looking out for obviously legal potholes because everybody is litigious these days. Standards and practices, they're looking for anything that might ding the franchise because now it's not just you and Spider-Man. Spider-Man's now worth $1.5 billion.
Right.
Okay. So now we got all these people. And so we get, I will get a script approved by, say, Tom Brevoort at Marvel. Who is a very powerful guy at Marvel and can pretty much do what he wants at Marvel, except, when the Disney folks send back, he'll send, we were doing a U.S. agent over at Marvel, and U.S. agent, when they asked me to write it, I wrote it the way the character was created by Mark Gruenwald. Right. I knew Mark Gruenwald, is a friend of mine, God bless him, great guy, but he created this character, U.S. agent, and U.S. agent was kind of a jerk. He was a little reactionary. I want to tread carefully about what I say here because I don't want to get anybody riled up. But he was kind of over there, right. And he was a little, just a tad racist, So I was writing him as the way I recall Mark writing him. And I worked this all out with Tom, and we worked through the story, and everything was approved, and the script was approved and everything. We got it lettered. The book was ready to go out the door. And then the notes come back from standards and practices because Disney, Marvel Studios was putting U.S. Agent into the TV series, into the streaming series, Winter Soldier. Right?
Falcon and Winter Soldier.
Falcon and Winter Soldier. So now, okay, we have to be very careful about how we handle U.S. Agent, and U.S. Agent, he really can't be quite that reactionary, right. So the script would come back, even though it was approved, the book would come back and it would have all these red marks on it, and there's all the stuff that he couldn't say, and all these things that we couldn't do, and it becomes very frustrating. So nowadays, when you hear that editorial interference, understand it doesn't always necessarily come from editorial. Right. A lot of times the editors, they want to do the most creative thing that they can do, but a lot of times now, more than ever, it's out of their hands.